North Korea just threatened the United States with war. Not over Taiwan, not over nuclear weapons, over a military leader in Africa that most Americans have never heard of. His name is Ibrahim Traoré. He runs Burkina Faso, a landlocked country in the Sahel. And Pyongyang just told Washington, touch him, and there will be consequences. The U.S. Senate wants him arrested. North Korea says that's a red line. This isn't about one man. This is about a global power shift happening in real time. And what comes next could ignite a crisis no one saw coming. This is how it started. North Korea has just issued what may be one of the most provocative warnings of the year. And it has nothing to do with missiles over the Pacific or nuclear tests in the mountains near Pyongyang. This time, the target is Washington's pressure campaign against Ibrahim Traoré, the military leader of Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in West Africa that most geopolitical observers had written off as a minor player in the global arena. But that assessment is now dangerously outdated. Pyongyang's message was unambiguous. Any attempt by the United States to arrest or forcibly remove Traoré would be considered a hostile act, one that could trigger consequences reaching far beyond the dusty streets of Ouagadougou. This isn't diplomatic posturing. This is a calculated signal that the battle for influence in Africa has entered a new and volatile phase, one where Cold War-era proxies have been replaced by a fluid network of defiant states willing to back each other against what they see as Western overreach. The question is no longer whether Traoré will fall in line with Western demands. The question is whether the world is prepared for what happens if he doesn't. To understand how we arrived at this moment, you have to rewind to the weeks before North Korea's warning, when the U.S. Senate released a report that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. The report didn't mince words. It called for accountability measures against Ibrahim Traoré, accusing his government of human rights abuses, unlawful detentions, and a dangerous consolidation of power that threatens regional stability. The Senate's language was sharp, naming Traoré directly and framing him as a destabilizing force whose actions demand international consequences. For many in Washington, this was a logical next step in a broader strategy to counter the rising tide of anti-Western sentiment sweeping across the Sahel. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have all experienced military coups in recent years, and each new government has systematically expelled French troops, severed colonial-era agreements, and pivoted toward Russia and other non-Western powers. The Senate report was meant to send a message. There are limits to how far African leaders can defy the international order without facing repercussions. But Traoré is not a leader who responds to pressure with compliance. Since seizing power in September 2022, he has positioned himself as the face of a new African sovereignty movement, one that rejects what he calls the neo-colonial structures that have kept the continent dependent on former European powers. His speeches are fiery and unapologetic, often invoking Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso who was assassinated in 1987 after challenging French influence and advocating for Pan-African self-determination. Traoré has embraced that legacy with a fervor that resonates deeply with a generation of young Africans who see him not as a dictator, but as a defiant symbol of resistance. When French troops were asked to leave, Traoré didn't just comply with public pressure. He accelerated the process, turning the expulsion into a public celebration of sovereignty. When Wagner Group mercenaries and Russian military advisors arrived to fill the security vacuum, he framed it as a pragmatic choice, a rejection of the Western military playbook that had failed to stop the jihadist violence tearing through the Sahel. To his supporters, Traoré is a hero. To his critics, he is a reckless authoritarian playing with fire. But either way, he has made it clear that he will not be dictated to by Washington or Brussels. The Senate report was always going to provoke a response, but no one expected it to come from Pyongyang. North Korea's involvement in African geopolitics is not new, but it has historically been quiet, transactional, and largely focused on weapon sales, construction projects, and the occasional training of military personnel. The relationship between North Korea and various African states stretches back decades, rooted in Cold War alliances and a shared anti-imperialist rhetoric. What makes this warning different is the directness, the timing, and the implied commitment. North Korea is not just expressing solidarity in vague diplomatic terms. It is drawing a red line, one that suggests Pyongyang sees Traoré's survival as strategically important to its own broader goals. This is where the stakes become clear. If North Korea is willing to issue such a warning, it means Traoré has become more than just a regional figure. He has become a symbol in a larger contest, one that pits a US-led international order against a loose coalition of states that reject American dominance and are willing to support each other in defiance. The geopolitical logic behind North Korea's warning is not difficult to decode. Pyongyang has spent years building ties with states that share its hostility toward Western influence, from Syria to Venezuela to Zimbabwe. These relationships are not based on ideology in the traditional sense. North Korea is not trying to export communism or spread its political model. Instead, it operates within a transactional network where mutual defiance becomes the basis for cooperation. If the United States can pressure or remove leaders who challenge its interests, then no government in this network is safe. By backing Traoré, North Korea is reinforcing a principle: that resistance to Western pressure will be met with solidarity, not isolation. It is a message directed not just at Washington, but at every government considering whether to align with the multipolar coalition that Russia, China, Iran, and now North Korea are quietly assembling. The warning also serves a domestic purpose for Pyongyang. It allows Kim Jong-un's regime to position itself as a credible defender of sovereignty, a counterweight to American interventionism, and a player in global affairs despite its geographic isolation and economic limitations. For Traoré, North Korea's intervention is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provides him with diplomatic cover at a moment when Western pressure is intensifying. It signals to his domestic audience and to other African leaders that he is not alone, that there are powers willing to stand behind him if the United States escalates. This is critical for his legitimacy. Traoré's government is fragile, facing internal dissent, economic strain, and a brutal insurgency that shows no signs of abating. The symbolic boost of having a nuclear-armed state issue a warning on his behalf cannot be underestimated. It transforms him from a vulnerable coup leader into a figure of international consequence. But the risk is equally significant. Aligning with North Korea, even passively, invites a level of international scrutiny and potential isolation that could undermine Burkina Faso's ability to attract investment, secure humanitarian aid, or engage with moderate African states that are wary of being pulled into a wider confrontation. Traoré is walking a tightrope, trying to leverage external support without becoming so entangled with controversial allies that he loses the flexibility to maneuver. The United States now faces a decision that it almost certainly did not anticipate when the Senate report was drafted. The original calculus was straightforward: apply pressure, rally international support for sanctions or accountability measures, and force Traoré to moderate his behavior or risk becoming a pariah. But North Korea's warning has changed the equation. If Washington proceeds with any form of aggressive action, whether through the International Criminal Court, sanctions targeting Traoré personally, or covert support for opposition forces, it risks triggering a response not just from Burkina Faso, but from a network of states that are actively seeking to challenge American influence. This is not a scenario the U.S. wants to navigate. The Biden administration, and now any future administration, must weigh the strategic value of holding Traoré accountable against the risk of escalating tensions with actors who have little to lose and are eager to test American resolve. The warning also complicates regional diplomacy. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, has struggled to respond to the wave of coups and anti-democratic movements across the Sahel. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have all withdrawn from the bloc or threatened to do so, accusing it of being a tool of French and American interests. If the U.S. is seen as trying to forcibly remove Traoré, it could accelerate the fracturing of ECOWAS and push more African states toward non-alignment or outright hostility to Western involvement. Russia's role in this crisis cannot be ignored. While North Korea issued the warning, Moscow is almost certainly watching with satisfaction. Russia has invested heavily in expanding its influence across the Sahel, using Wagner Group forces, arms sales, and diplomatic support to position itself as the security partner of choice for governments that have soured on Western engagement. Traoré's Burkina Faso is a key piece of that strategy. If the United States succeeds in pressuring or removing him, it sends a signal that Russia's protection is not enough, that alignment with Moscow leaves African leaders vulnerable. But if Traoré survives and even thrives despite American pressure, it validates the Russian model and encourages other leaders to take the same path. North Korea's warning serves Russian interests perfectly. It broadens the coalition backing Traoré. It internationalizes the crisis in a way that makes unilateral American action more risky. And it reinforces the narrative that a multipolar world order is emerging, one where the United States can no longer dictate outcomes without facing coordinated resistance. China, by contrast, has remained conspicuously silent. Beijing has deepened its economic ties across Africa in recent years, investing in infrastructure, trade, and resource extraction on a scale that dwarfs both Western and Russian involvement. But China's approach has been cautious, avoiding overt political alignment with governments that attract significant international controversy. Traoré's Burkina Faso is not a major economic partner for China, and Beijing has little to gain from publicly backing him. At the same time, China is watching closely. If the United States moves aggressively against Traoré and succeeds, it sets a precedent for how Western powers might treat other leaders who align with non-Western interests. If the U.S. backs down in the face of North Korean and potential Russian support, it suggests that the era of unchallenged American influence is over. Either way, the outcome will shape China's calculations in its own spheres of influence, from the South China Sea to Latin America. What happens next could redefine the region. The immediate risk is that the crisis escalates in unpredictable ways. North Korea's warning is not backed by a military presence in West Africa, and Pyongyang lacks the logistical capacity to intervene directly if the United States decides to act. But the warning itself is enough to create uncertainty, to raise the political cost of any American move, and to embolden Traoré to resist pressure more aggressively. There is also the danger of miscalculation. If the United States interprets North Korea's involvement as a bluff and proceeds with accountability measures anyway, it could trigger a response from other actors, Russia, Iran, or even non-state groups aligned with Traoré, that spirals into a wider confrontation. The Sahel is already a powder keg, with jihadist insurgencies, ethnic tensions, and collapsing state institutions creating conditions ripe for violence. Adding a geopolitical flashpoint into that mix is a recipe for disaster. For the people of Burkina Faso, this crisis is not an abstract contest between great powers. It is a daily reality of insecurity, economic hardship, and political uncertainty. Traoré came to power promising to restore security and sovereignty, but the jihadist violence has only intensified under his leadership. Thousands have been killed, hundreds of thousands have been displaced, and large swaths of the country remain outside government control. The alliance with Russia has brought weapons and mercenaries, but it has not brought peace. Now, with North Korea issuing warnings on Traoré's behalf and the United States threatening accountability, the risk is that Burkina Faso becomes a battleground for forces that care little about the welfare of its people. The international attention may boost Traoré's profile, but it does nothing to address the fundamental challenges facing the country. If anything, it risks deepening the isolation and instability that have made Burkina Faso one of the most fragile states in the world. The broader implications extend far beyond one country or one leader. This crisis is a test case for how the international system will handle defiance in the multipolar era. For decades, the United States and its allies could pressure, sanction, or isolate governments that challenged their interests with relative impunity. The assumption was that most states, especially in the developing world, lacked the resources or alliances to resist effectively. But that assumption is breaking down. Traoré is not operating in a vacuum. He is part of a growing network of states and leaders who see alignment with non-Western powers as a viable alternative to subordination to the West. North Korea's warning is a signal that this network is willing to defend its own at least rhetorically, and possibly in more tangible ways if pushed. The question is whether the United States and its allies are prepared to accept a world where their influence is contested, where accountability mechanisms can be blocked or ignored, and where defiant leaders can survive and even thrive by playing great powers against each other. There is also a deeper question about what accountability means in this context. The U.S. Senate report highlights legitimate concerns about human rights and governance in Burkina Faso. Traoré's government has been accused of extrajudicial killings, restrictions on press freedom, and a lack of transparency that makes it difficult to assess the true state of the country. But the credibility of American calls for accountability is undermined by the inconsistency with which such standards are applied. The United States maintains close relationships with governments in Africa and beyond that have far worse human rights records than Burkina Faso. Yet those leaders face no Senate reports, no threats of sanctions, no calls for arrest. The perception, rightly or wrongly, is that accountability is a tool of geopolitical leverage, not a principle applied universally. This perception fuels the narrative that Traoré and leaders like him are promoting. That Western criticism is not about justice or human rights, but about maintaining control and punishing those who challenge the existing order. North Korea's warning taps into that narrative, framing the U.S. pressure campaign as an act of aggression rather than a defense of democratic values. The role of regional actors in this crisis has been notably muted. ECOWAS, the African Union, and neighboring states have issued statements calling for dialogue and de-escalation, but none have taken a strong public stance either in support of or against Traoré. This reflects the deep divisions within African institutions about how to respond to the wave of military takeovers and anti-Western sentiment. Some leaders sympathize with Traoré's defiance and see his resistance to French and American pressure as a legitimate assertion of sovereignty. Others are deeply concerned about the precedent it sets, the instability it creates, and the risk that their own countries could be drawn into a wider conflict. The silence from many African capitals is not neutrality. It is paralysis, a recognition that any position they take could alienate powerful external actors or inflame domestic politics. This paralysis leaves a vacuum that North Korea, Russia, and other external powers are eager to fill. If the United States decides to escalate, the options are limited and fraught with risk. Direct military intervention is almost certainly off the table. The American public has little appetite for another foreign entanglement, and the logistical and political costs of trying to remove Traoré by force would be prohibitive. Sanctions are more likely, but their effectiveness is questionable. Burkina Faso's economy is already under strain, and targeted sanctions against Traoré personally would do little to change his behavior if he has external backers willing to provide financial and material support. The International Criminal Court could be invoked, but the ICC has limited enforcement power and a track record of being ignored by states that do not recognize its authority. Even if an arrest warrant were issued, Traoré could simply refuse to travel to countries that might detain him, limiting the practical impact. The most likely scenario is that the United States pursues a combination of diplomatic pressure, targeted sanctions, and public condemnation, while quietly working to isolate Traoré and undermine his support base. But this strategy assumes that Traoré's position is fragile, and that assumption may no longer hold. Is this a strategic move or the start of a larger shift? North Korea's warning is not just about Burkina Faso. It is a statement of intent, a demonstration that the multipolar coalition is willing to take risks and challenge American actions in regions that were once considered peripheral. If this warning is followed by similar interventions in other crises, it suggests a coordinated effort to test and erode U.S. influence wherever possible. The danger is that each individual crisis seems manageable in isolation, but collectively they create a pattern of declining American credibility and effectiveness. The United States cannot respond forcefully to every challenge without overextending itself, but failing to respond risks emboldening more defiance. This is the central dilemma of the multipolar era, and Burkina Faso is becoming a proving ground for how that dilemma will play out. For Traoré, the path forward is narrow and treacherous. He has gained international attention and external support, but he has also painted a target on his back. The United States does not forget, and the machinery of diplomatic and economic pressure can grind slowly but relentlessly. Traoré's survival depends on his ability to maintain domestic support, deliver on security promises, and navigate the competing interests of his external backers without becoming entirely dependent on any one of them. If the jihadist violence continues to escalate, if the economy deteriorates further, if internal opposition grows, then no amount of external support will save him. The warning from North Korea buys him time, but time is only valuable if he uses it to consolidate his position and address the underlying crises facing his country. There is little evidence so far that he is capable of doing so. The international community is now watching Burkina Faso with a level of attention it has rarely received. The crisis has become a proxy for larger questions about sovereignty, accountability, and the future of global order. Every move by the United States, every response from Traoré, every signal from North Korea or Russia will be analyzed for what it reveals about the balance of power and the willingness of different actors to defend their interests. The risk is that this scrutiny creates pressure for escalation, that both sides feel compelled to demonstrate resolve even when de-escalation would be the wiser choice. The logic of brinkmanship can take on a life of its own, especially when domestic audiences and international allies are watching. The outcome of this crisis is uncertain, and that uncertainty is itself a source of danger. If the United States backs down, it risks emboldening other leaders to defy Western pressure and seek protection from non-Western powers. If it escalates, it risks triggering a confrontation that spirals beyond control and draws in actors with little interest in de-escalation. If Traoré survives, he becomes a symbol of successful resistance and a model for others to follow. If he falls, it sends a message that defiance has limits and that alignment with Russia, North Korea, and other controversial powers is not enough to guarantee survival. Either way, the crisis in Burkina Faso is no longer just about one country or one leader. It is about the future of influence in Africa, the credibility of competing power blocks, and the question of whether the international system can manage conflicts in the multipolar era without descending into chaos. The world is watching, and the stakes are higher than almost anyone anticipated when the Senate report was first released. What began as a call for accountability has become a flashpoint in a contest that will shape the next decade of global politics. The ink may have barely dried on that report, but the consequences are already unfolding, and there is no clear path back to the relative stability that existed just weeks ago. The crisis is here, the lines are drawn, and the question is no longer whether this moment matters, but how far the world is willing to go to defend competing visions of order, sovereignty, and power.